Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will get started in just a few minutes, so please be patient and make sure that you are on mute as well. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you for waiting. All right, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started now. I'll hand it over to our Executive Director, Laurent Hubert.
Thank you, Maya. And so welcome everyone to this webinar today, which is organized by ASH, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, and the DC Tobacco Free Coalition. And today will be, it's not a typical webinar, it's actually more of a mini training on how to use the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which will, the acronym we use is CERD, which is one of the very few UN human rights treaties that the US has ratified. And today we'll discuss how we can use this treaty to advance tobacco control and reduce health disparities in the United States. And just very, very quickly, I just want to, before we get started, put it into context, because what are we talking about when we talk about human rights? When we talk about human rights, we talk about the rights that have been recognized at the highest level of international law and codified through international UN human rights treaties. And those involve the right to health, the right to information, the right to a healthy environment, among others. And they often protect some very specific groups. So for example, children, women, or minorities. And the elimination of all forms of discrimination is really at the core of a human rights-based approach of any topic to address any human rights issue. And so when those treaties are developed and then ratified, they become by a country, they become legally binding to that country. So when ratified, the country has obligation under that treaty. And a number of social issues and social groups that work on social issues really use human rights treaties as a platform to advance progress towards that issue and hold governments accountable. So for example, in the context of, for example, to ensure access to retroviral drugs for HIV/AIDS patients in South Africa, they used a human rights-based approach to ensure access to retroviral drugs. In the context of tobacco, for example, we used it in Germany. We were able to get civil society to influence the committee that monitors the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child for Germany, and we managed to get them to have a specific recommendation on tobacco. So when it comes to CERD, the US, the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, the US signed it in 1996 and ratified it in 1994. So that's one of the very few UN human rights treaties the US has ratified. And the US is up for review in August. And this is a review that takes place about every 5 years. And the review is done by a committee, which is a group of experts that reviews progress made by countries towards the obligation under that treaty. And those are about 18 individual experts who are elected every 4 years. And this committee basically looks at the progress made by each country, and they make then concluding observations, which are recommendations that go to the country. So this really provides a unique opportunity for advocates in the United States to really request that the CERD committee call on the United States to take steps towards health equity by advancing and accelerating health bans in the United States in order to protect the health of African Americans, among others, obviously. So really, this is what one of the objectives of the work we're going to do. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is used by a lot of other groups working on other social justice issues. So today's webinar will give you an in-depth explanation on how to participate in this process. What's also quite exciting is that all of you will have the opportunity to formally engage in this process, because you will hear from the speakers today. There's a very specific report that has been submitted once and will be now submitted to this committee. And given that the US is due for review, you will have the opportunity to be part of that process and really join this fight and support it and actually take fully advantage of what this international human rights treaty can offer to advance tobacco control in the US. So your organization will have an opportunity to sign on to this. And then when you learn how to engage in this process to further engage in working with the committee, to make oral statements, subsequent communications and advocacy opportunities and comms opportunities that we can really build up on this campaign. So we will, without further ado, I'll introduce the speakers. But before I introduce the speakers, feel free to type questions to any of the panelists. And please use the icon that's at the bottom of the screen with the Q&A box. You can use the chat box on the side, but it might be missed. So we recommend you to really use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to direct any questions to any of the panelists. So we'll start with the very first panelist, who's Carol McGruder, who's the chair of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. And she will provide just a very brief overground of menthol in the United States and why this is such an issue. Carol, the floor is yours. And I believe we need to have one of the technical support to make you co-host so you can share you. Perfect.
Okay, good morning, everybody. We have all been just working so hard while I'm being given the co-host capability. I just want to really acknowledge ASH as one of our partners in this fight, and that we are also co-plaintiffs on the lawsuit against the FDA. And I just have a long-term relationship with Ash and Laurent when we were working on the FCTC back many years ago, when we thought that might actually get this job done that we're still engaged in all these years later. So here we are. So can you see my screen? Okay, fabulous. So this is the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, of which I am one of the very proud co-chairs along with Dr. Philip Gardner. And we have really been at the head of the forefront of the fight to get mentholated tobacco products off of the US market since President Obama signed the Tobacco Control Act in 2009. This is a slide from a project that I had in San Francisco, and this is probably when I first met Laurent, Communities Under Siege, and really making the connection of the global fight against the tobacco industry, and in particular, the pernicious predatory activities that go on against Black people all over the world. So whether we're Africans in America, African Americans, or Africans in Africa. And the picture that you see to the left is a sharecropper in Nigeria, tobacco, cultivator, and with the promise, the industry, that there's growth in agriculture. And so I used to show this slide in my presentations to African Americans because sharecropping was what happened after slavery, and we are very familiar with that process. So this is a common fight, and it's a common fight for African Americans, but for all of us to be engaged in, which is what we are. So I always would talk about how we play checkers and the tobacco industry plays chess. We have funding cycles that last 2 or 3 years with some boxes that we need to check. And the big picture, we haven't focused on the big picture the way that we needed to until these last few years. So part of that is what we're doing with the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Racial Discrimination, also with the end game that's being driven out of California. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So in the African American community, this is one of my favorite films, The Godfather. And in this, they talk about how they were going to, when they brought in drugs, they were going to leave them with the coloreds, with the blacks, because we quote unquote had no souls. And that's how the tobacco industry has approached us. And just as The Godfather, drugs did not stay. They might have been introduced into our communities, but they certainly didn't stay there. And neither does mentholated tobacco products and the predatory activities that the industry has perpetrated on African Americans. So we know the Tobacco Control Act was signed in 2009. At that time, menthol was left in. It was given an exemption when all the other flavors were taken out. And that was where it became really the focus of our work. We know that this exclusion of menthol was not based on science, but they'll hold us to scientific standards when they're trying to delay anything. But it was a bargain. It was a deal that was made. And that fight. So what we're doing is we're not trying to take menthol off the market and then tell Black people to smoke non-mentholated products, but we're using the example of what has been done with menthol, with the predatory marketing as a tool, as a way to broaden this conversation with what the industry does to all of us. And I want to highlight, and this is part of this conversation. So on June 1st, the city of Los Angeles passed their bill to take menthol and flavored tobacco products off the market by 12-0, so a unanimous vote. And so this was the press conference that we held, and this was a very hard-won fight. And Los Angeles is really, it's not the microcosm, it is the cosm for the racism that we see perpetrated on African Americans. And I was raised partially in Los Angeles. These are pictures. So this was pretty sweet for me personally, because I lived through, this is the Watts riot that happened in the 60s. I was a child and saw the plumes of smoke coming up out of Watts. This was the police brutality that we saw daily on TV, on the news, and in person. I've seen this in person in Los Angeles. And so the industry uses the racism that we have endured in our country and flips it, that taking menthol off the market would be racist to Black people, because that's what we quote unquote prefer, and that's what we like. This was the Rodney King insurrections that happened in the 90s. So just that repetition. So the industry really worked hard in Los Angeles, which has the African-American population in California, to really dig into our emotions, our legitimate concerns and fears, our post-traumatic stress syndrome that I have from Los Angeles, to flip it and to harness those feelings, which are genuine, to try to block public health policy for all of us. So in Canada and the European Union, there was no consideration or talk about Black Canadians or Africans in Europe and what they want, that they wanted menthol. It was simply a health conversation, but the racial overlay that we continue to face all the time, and that has been highlighted and exacerbated with George Floyd and all of the things that we're able to see now live on TV and social media. So our strategy is to face that head on, to deal with the industry infiltrating and utilizing our leaders to harness these feelings that we have, to block public health policy for us and for everyone. So we here at the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council will continue our collaboration with ASH on all of the fronts that we're on. We want people to go to our website as well, where we will have a petition signing on about particularly African Americans and the plight with menthol. We are also, so this is a foundational pillar of our fight, the fight, and including the international focus on this. And we're also going to be having municipal resolutions. So cities in the state of California will be signing non-binding resolutions that acknowledge our in-game goals, which are to take combustible cigarettes off of the market altogether, and also to acknowledge the violations to the treaty, in particularly for African Americans. And we see things in black and white in America, but of course there are all other groups and other people that have had these predatory activities, and we stand in solidarity with that fight, with our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, our Latinos. We are, 15% of the population, but 85% of African Americans who smoke menthol because of these predatory activities. But of course, there are millions of other menthol consumers in the United States. So with that, I'm going to pass it back. And then I think we will be taking questions at the end.
Yes, we'll take questions. And thank you very much, Carol. This is quite helpful. And thank you for reminding us that the non-action on menthol was not based on science, was purely was on for corporate benefit and political manipulation in some cases. And the global consensus, the global legal consensus on the tobacco treaty, by the way, which you mentioned in the beginning, makes it very clear under this guideline that basically it solely supports the menthol ban. So US non-action was really not living up to its commitments under various treaties that it's either engaged in, including CERD, as we'll discuss more. And also, thank you for mentioning that the industry co-opts and uses the arguments to their favor. And that's something we must not allow it. And we know that even with, for example, the African-American community really uses CERD to address other social justice issues in the United States. So for example, access to voting, for example, other health equities. So we must use it as a tool in the tobacco control community also. It would be a shame for us not to. And I really like what you're doing, Carol, and we'll discuss that more later on. Bring it local to global is really using both that, that
yes,
those international obligations, but bringing them to the local level, and how inaction at the local level also is a violation to the rights that the US has agreed to at the highest level through international commitments. I'll introduce the next speaker now, who's Charles Debnam, who's Deputy Chief Executive Officer, who's going to, and he's been very, very involved with the DC coalition and involving the first draft of the report, which then became a national report, and now it's also expanding even further. So if you can take us explain a little bit about the process and how you found it also helpful in the local DC fight to get menthol phased out of the market.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laurent, for actually asking me to come and just talk a little bit about how the DC Tobacco Free Coalition participated in this project and the outcome. So I do represent, I wear a lot of hats actually, but I represent the DC Tobacco Free Coalition on this particular activity. And the mission of the coalition is to improve the health of the District of Columbia residents by decreasing the morbidity and mortality associated with tobacco use and exposure through education, public policy, and advocacy using culturally and linguistically competent approaches. So when we were approached by ASH, as a matter of fact, to kind of look at this task and see if this is something that fit into with our mission, and to see if we could take a stab at maybe doing the first draft, we absolutely did. So Liz, who is with ASH, she's also the chair of our coalition, really worked with us in making sure that the coalition was involved in this process. So we did take on the task. This was actually moved to the into my committee on the coalition, and I took the first stab at writing the draft. So we used a template that the ASH had sent us. There were several templates, and from different treaties that different countries had used. And we looked at several of them, and we identified one that we wanted to use. And from that, we started incorporating information and resources and research that we knew was adequate for this particular treaty. And from that, it then grew. From that, it then went to AATCLC, and then ASH had their input. And then that's when it moved into a more of a national approach. And it took on, wings of its own, and it became this great document that we use and can use here in the District of Columbia, especially now, just like Carol mentioned, they're, banning tobacco in California. DC has banned flavored tobacco here in DC, and it becomes effective October 1st. So that was very instrumental. That document actually was shared with our DC Council members, along with a lot of other documents that we made sure that they had. So we definitely were encouraged, and we wanted to participate in this whole project and getting that information out. We are now looking at, we're participating in the review, which will come up in August, working with Kelsey and making sure that adequate language is added to that. I know that there was a whole piece. We wanted to make sure that equity was included. We wanted to make sure that things like cessation was included. We wanted to also include information that, that no harm would come to individuals if pack a cigarette, that whole enforcement piece. So we wanted to make sure that all of those pieces were covered into the document. And then that whole outreach also piece was important. We had, I think, and Kelsey probably will talk about this a little later, is that there are, I think, about 97 organizations and individuals that actually signed on to this letter, and it probably would have grown a lot longer. So there is another opportunity for those same organizations to sign on to the new treaty that will be submitted for August, along with the 97 new treaty. So we're looking forward to that. So that's our participation, and we continue to participate. We continue, just like Carol mentioned, to collaborate, with folks like AATCLC, with ASH on different projects like this, and look forward to it.
So thank you so much, and thank you for this first report, which already had an impact just ahead of the outcome of the FDA ruling. That before the judge, that there was a ruling on that. We think it had a pause, and it did get some media pickup. And then thank you now for engaging in the next steps, which is the revision, making sure you cover all elements, including the non-targeted police action, for example, that could be, and making it very clear, this is not about use and possession. This is about the commercial selling and marketing of those products.
Correct.
Addressing those issues. And then the very important part, which is going to be outreach and communication, which is letting not only the committee know, and the committee make their recommendation back to the United States, but how do we use it to really transmit that message to the general public in the United States, so they're fully aware of that obligation the US has. Mm-hmm. And the lack of action on mental is another way of discriminating against part of the US population.
That's right.
So now we'll welcome the third speaker, who's actually going to be Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy, who's one of ASH's attorneys. And she will basically address a little bit back, what do we engage in this? Why does it matter for us to engage and write those reports and engage in that process? And then she will take us through the technical elements, what needs to happen between now and August, and how you can engage, how you can get your organization involved in this process. And that doesn't matter whether in the United States or abroad. There's room for both, for groups in the United States to get involved, but it also matters for the rest of, for the committee and the country being reviewed to know that the rest of the world is looking. And we've noticed that that does matter in other countries. So Kelsey, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So thank you all for joining us today. And I just wanted to take a step back and reemphasize why we're having this training right now. Our report to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is eligible to be resubmitted in the right cycle for the United States. The United States is due for its hearing in August. That's once every 5 years. So this is a really unique opportunity. And I know we've probably lost some people in the multiple reporting process, but this is the one that counts. So I want to really make sure that we're emphasizing that. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about why a human rights report matters, what it even does. And then I'm going to talk about the specifics of this reporting process and what you all can do. So first, tobacco is a human rights violation. It infringes on the right to life, the right to health, the right to education, children's rights, women's rights, and many others, and including having health equity issues, which is why we're here today. So the argument for tobacco as a human rights issue is that everyone has a right to life and health. Governments have a duty to enforce those rights, and therefore governments have a duty to protect their citizens from the harms of the tobacco industry. When they don't, legal remedies are available. So today we're talking about governments, specifically the US government, not protecting its citizens from menthol advertising and menthol cigarettes actions by the tobacco industry. And one of the remedies that's available is to go to these human rights committees, specifically the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and ask them to hold the US government accountable. So that's how this works in a human rights-based argument. An easier or simpler way to talk about human rights is that there are a couple principles: protect, respect, and remedy. Corporations are supposed to protect, or I'm sorry, governments are supposed to protect citizens' rights. Industries should respect those rights. When they don't, there's a remedy. So it's just a very simple way to think about the previous slide. I also wanted to pause and talk about the difference between social justice and human rights. In the United States, human rights is not a concept that we talk about all that frequently, but social justice is becoming more and more popular of a concept. They're very similar, they're not identical, but sometimes it really helps with our human rights concepts to frame them as a social justice issue, because obviously menthol is a social justice issue as well as a human rights issue. So particularly when using this report for advocacy in the United States, it might be helpful to use the term social justice instead of necessarily using human rights. So using human rights in the US, as I've mentioned, is a little bit complicated. The United States does not often sign on to human rights treaties because it has the force of national law. So once we sign it, it's the same as the Constitution or any other federal law. So it's pretty uncommon for the US to ratify. The United States has not ratified the ones on the screen: the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Many of you have probably heard this before. You've probably heard me say it before, but we're one of three countries in the world that have not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think the other ones are, one of them Somalia. So, you know, we're in great company there. So it's pretty unusual that countries don't sign on to these, but the US is unique in that way. However, the US has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which doesn't have a lot of wiggle room for tobacco control, and the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which has a clause in it about public health, which allows us to bring in tobacco and other issues. So I wanted to stop right here and tell a quick story before I talk about the FDA. As many of you know, Ash was a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the FDA with AATCLC. So these works all tie together, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But first, that Newport advertisement was mailed to me at my home maybe about 5 years ago. So you can see who they're targeting. I mean, it's pretty obvious from the picture who they're trying to target with these images. The picture of the store, that's a store right near my house. It's walking distance from my house, actually. And my 5-year-old has just learned to read. And she's at the stage where she's reading everything. You know, speed limit signs, every sign we pass, she's reading it out loud because she's 5 and that's what they do. So she noticed the sign and goes, "Mommy, that's a smoking store." And I said, yeah, I know. And she goes, they're tricking people by selling them flavors. And I didn't even know she listened to that kind of work that I do. But if my 5-year-old can get that that's a trick, I'm pretty sure that it's time for the FDA to get it too. So with that in mind, AATCLC and ASH sued the FDA for their inaction on menthol cigarettes. We were later joined by the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association. Part of our lawsuit was asking them, the FDA, to respond to the citizens petition, which had been submitted by many civil society organizations almost a decade ago, asking for the same thing. The FDA is legally obligated to respond to citizens petitions, and they had not done that. So as part of our lawsuit, we asked them to respond to that and to take action to ban menthol. About a year ago, they came out and said they were going to propose a rule. And in April, they proposed that rule. So that's very exciting. And we are definitely taking that into consideration in our new drafting of our report to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Because when we first wrote it, we filed it right before the rule came out from the FDA. So there was not a rule yet. So we had written it saying the FDA can take legal action, but hasn't. So we had to tweak the report a little bit and adjust it. Unfortunately, the FDA is a slow process, as you all know. So I don't think there's any problem in asking the CERD committee to stay on top of the US government while the FDA continues to do this. We'd be very lucky if we had an FDA rule a year or two from now, but I think with the industry lawsuits and things that are likely coming, it's probably going to be a lot longer than that. So hopefully this is a way to keep the pressure, the international pressure on. So I mentioned that when we filed with the FDA, we also submitted this to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We had a lot of signatories sign on, which was fantastic. It's great to show the committee, particularly international signatories, that a lot of people care about this and a lot of people from a lot of different places. The committee was unfortunately out of cycle, which we knew when we submitted it. Part of why we submitted it was to get press attention and to hopefully draw the US government's attention to it as well. But now we have the opportunity to do it in cycle, which has much more impact on the committee itself, because the committee hasn't sat in session to think about the United States since we submitted the first report. So we have an opportunity to resubmit, to tweak it for the FDA, which we did. We've adjusted it to express some concerns over the FDA rule, primarily the loopholes around menthol as a characterizing flavor and the lack of legal definition of what that is, and also concerns about the timeline. So that's where we are with the report. A couple of important dates coming up. The FDA comments on the proposed rule close on July 5th. I mentioned several times that these are linked. It's really, really important that everyone who can comment on the FDA rule, because we want a good FDA rule. These are absolutely not mutually exclusive. They are meant to support each other. So please don't miss that deadline. It looks likely that it will be extended, but don't depend on it. So please comment on the FDA rule, and CTFK and the Public Health Law Center have put together some great templates. If you need some help, Ash is happy to help as well. So please make sure to do that. Our CERD report, which will go to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, will open for sign-ons today, and the deadline for sign-ons will be July 15th. We would really love to beat that number that we had last time. So we're looking for about 100 signatories, if not more. And that's really important to show the committee how many people care about this. So please share it with friends in other countries, colleagues in things just outside the silo of tobacco control. It doesn't necessarily need to be tobacco control people signing on. So please feel free to share it widely. After we get all the sign-ons and close it up and, put everyone's logo on it, make it look nice, we'll submit it in late July. and there will be an opportunity for communications. I'm sorry, that should say communications opportunity, not sign on. Oh, no, sorry, my mistake, it's right. In late July, there will be an opportunity to sign on to an oral intervention. The committee will have a hearing in August. Usually you have to register for the oral intervention about 2 or 3 weeks before the hearing. So we want the opportunity to actually speak to the government as well. Fair warning, they're incredibly short statements. We usually get about 1.5 minutes. If multiple people would like to give statements, I think that's a great idea, and I'd be happy to talk about that. You may need to have ECOSEC status. If you don't know what that is, but you're interested, please contact me and we can discuss that. So right around the same time, in late July, we'll submit the report, and Megan's going to talk a little bit about the communications opportunities when I'm finished, but it's a great opportunity for us to spread it across social media, to pitch it to reporters, that this report went to the committee and that we want the committee to hear about it. The committee are people, some of them are Americans, and they read newspapers too. So we obviously would like as much news as possible to get back to them and to just the general public that we consider tobacco to be an issue within the discretion of this committee. After all of that, we'll have our actual hearing. It's tentatively scheduled for August 11th or 12th. The UN often changes those dates as things get moved around or important issues come up. So probably that week, but I can't give a more definitive date at the moment. And then after the hearing, we will do a joint communications launch with all the signatories to talk about this on social media and with the press. So what will we be talking about with the press and with social media? I put sort of the gold standard as, you know, my wish list here. What would happen if everyone in the United States woke up and cared about international law tomorrow? The ideal would be that the CERD committee makes all of our recommendations from our report to the US government. So for example, in our report, we suggest that the US government ratify the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So one of the things we would like to see is the CERD committee tell the US government, you should ratify the FCTC. The next step of that is the US government acknowledges and implements those requirements or recommendations. And then finally, lots of press. So that's sort of the gold standard, but we would very happily take the silver or the bronze. Silver being that we get some of our recommendations made to the government and some press. And the bronze, which honestly we'd still be very happy with, is if the CERD committee uses the word tobacco in their recommendations or conclusions. They have a lot of things to hear. There's obviously been a lot of racial issues in the United States in the last 5 years. So there's going to be a lot of people presenting on some very, very serious topics. And, you know, tobacco is important, but it's not the only important thing. So we obviously expect there to be a lot of things for them to focus on. So even if the word tobacco comes up in their recommendations or conclusions, I think we can call that a victory. If it doesn't come up at all, I still think that's really important to highlight in social media and in the press. And Megan's going to talk about some of that later too. We still can talk about tobacco as a human rights violation and change the thought, the general public's thought around that. It's still important in local advocacy. It would be great to go to your local government and say, this international committee says that we should do menthol reform, but I also think it's important, if we don't get it, to go to your local government and say, we asked an international committee and they won't do anything, so why don't you do it? So I think that either way, positive or negative, this is something we can use for local advocacy. So what can you do? I've talked about a lot of these things already, but I wanted to put them down on paper. First and foremost, please sign on to the CERD report. It's really important to have everyone's support. Also, submit a comment to the FDA. Again, they're linked. It's really important. Please help us publicize the report and the hearing. The more we talk about this, the more reporters and the general public and our communities sort of start to understand the process and why we're doing this. Also sign on to our oral statement. It's really impressive to be able to say Action on Smoking and Health, AATCLC, the DC Tobacco Free Coalition, and 100 organizations support this. So that's really, really important as well. And finally, use the CERD committee response for your local advocacy. We cannot take our foot off the gas on menthol reform. We should be working towards menthol bans and localities in the United States and around the world. The FDA is going to be slow. We know they're going to be slow. So we need to keep working on saving lives. And this is one more tool in our arsenal to do that. This page is actually being updated as we speak, so it'll look a little different when you go, but our report and our sign-on link will be on this page, and we will also send them out in the webinar notes at the end when we send a thank you note. Please feel free to share them widely, and there's also a bunch of other resources on this website, particularly about menthol and CERD, so that can be helpful as well. I've mentioned this a lot, but if you're really interested in this issue, please email me and sign up for the Human Rights and Tobacco Control Network, which is meant to be a group of advocates who use human rights tools. We'd love to have more members. And then there's also the Action Alerts forum on our website, which is a little more general information. And if you're a member of the Framework Convention Alliance, you can also sign up for the Human Rights Task Force. So that's it for me. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kelsey. This is quite helpful, and I think we can really get that gold. I think, and that's what we should strive to, and that's going to require the work of all of us, all of those. So you sent some very important dates from July 5th for the FDA comments, July 15th, the deadline to sign on, July, last opportunity for oral interventions to sign on to that, July 18th, the report submission, August 11 or 12, the hearing for the US for CERD, and then all of the comms around that. So really critical that all of you engage, sign on to this report, and encourage others to sign on. And one of the last points in Kelsey was really that importance of communication. It's really a new way to reframe tobacco in a different way and bring in new partners on board. In Spain, a few years ago, we were at a European conference, and I made a statement. There was a press conference, and I just made a statement that Spain would not live up to its obligations under human rights treaties if you need to do more on tobacco. And the reporters picked it up, and it made first page in the elite media in Spain on that day. It was quite surprising. So I think there's a lot about opportunities for communication and advocacy communication in framing it as a racial issue and as a violation, lack of action on menthol as a violation of obligations under human rights treaties, social justice issues treaties, and so on and so forth. So Megan Arendt Manning, or Manning Arendt, who manages our comms at ASH, she's going to mention opportunities how to use the CERD report for comms towards the end of August. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurent. So I'm excited to talk with everyone about how we can jointly amplify the CERD report, because it is a joint campaign. We figured it was worth talking with everyone about how we can work together on our communications efforts. So like Kelsey just said, there's two really big timing pushes that we'll put for communications. So after we submit the report, that July 15th until the hearing section will be the first big push that we'll do. So everything that I'll talk about next will happen twice. It'll happen in that first before the hearing push, and it'll happen second after that hearing push. We'll send you all sample content. Everyone who signs on to the report, we'll send you sample content for both of those separate timeframes, but just for your own planning purposes around the communications side of things, plan for two big pushes specifically. And obviously, like Kelsey was saying, the goal is to make it newsworthy. We want people talking about it. So a few tips on how to make the CERD report newsworthy in your local community is to connect it to other breaking news items. Oftentimes reporters I have to cover that local item already. And so if you're able to tie the CERD report in with those breaking news issues, it'll rise to the top of the conversation. Kelsey also had some really good language in there about connecting our health equity and social justice items in with the CERD report. So do that as well. Use a lot of that language, use a lot of those issues. There's several reporters are covering most articles from that angle right now. And so that'll really be helpful for us. You'll also want to highlight the stats of your local community and the health disparities associated with smoking, associated with menthol in your community, and who in your community is specifically hurt by tobacco. If you have any personal stories of someone hurt by tobacco, or like Kelsey shared a story of her daughter's experience with seeing a smoke shop in your community, share those. They're very compelling. I think I at least found Kelsey's story very compelling. If you see stories like that or hear of stories like that, they're always a really good hook to use to tie in for you. Then for media outreach in particular, we'll send out a sample press release that everyone can build off of. But if you're looking to write your own press release, Ash has a fact sheet on how to prepare a press release with the different components to just sort of walk you through it and make sure you're hitting those key points. We also have a fact sheet on how to write an op-ed and just a few tips on pitching. These will all be linked in the thank you email. They're also hyperlinked in this PowerPoint. So if you go back through the slides, you'll be able to click on them specifically. But op-eds are a great way to get local traction as well. Start out with that personal story of how tobacco has hurt you in your community, share localized stats, and tie in why the CERD report is important. We also then have a fact sheet on writing a letter to the editor. That's a much shorter way to write something. It's a shorter word count, but also very valuable. So look for those local outlets where your story will be most important. In addition to media outreach, you should definitely talk about this on your website. What we recommend is this is sort of how we promoted the CERD report the last time. So on Ash's website specifically, we did a blog on the topic. We have a content page on the issue of how tobacco companies are racially discriminating against minorities. And then when the report release came out, we published that joint press release. So I encourage you all to add on your website these different content items, the blog, a content page originally, to make sure people know about the issue, can be educated about the issue just through your website, and then have that media component when the report release happens. And these can all be found on our website too, if you're interested. Then for social media, you want to create graphics and videos. We have sample posts that we'll share with everyone for social media, but we've also shot some stock photography and videography of menthol cigarettes. So if you're looking to make your own graphics and just don't have the photos or aren't sure where to find them, we've got them for you. So feel free to grab any of those photos or videos to make your own content online. Everything on social media is driven by multimedia. So by having strong images and videos even more so. So use them at your disposal and it'll really help us drive more exposure. You can see some examples of the different types of videos Ash did previously. The one of Dr. Gardner is a montage, a couple videos are clipped together of him talking about it and Laurent talking about why menthol is a problem. That's a vertical form video. That's what is getting the most traction right now. So if you can do vertical form video, definitely do it. Then we have that one time to ban menthol is Laurent just talking direct to camera, saying this is an issue and why, and talking about stats. So you don't need a big video production to do that. These are recorded, that's recorded on his cell phone and still did very well. People take that as a very reputable thing if you're talking directly to a camera about something. So be passionate, pull out your cell phone and record yourself talking about why menthol is a problem. Then for the release specifically, Kelsey went live on our Facebook page, talked about the release, why it matters. We encourage you all to do the same on any of your social media networks. It's a great way to get more engagement. Then when you're on social media, tag people. Don't just post something in a graphic itself. You can tag people, especially on Instagram. You can hit to add more people so they'll see it and engage with you. On story, also tag people. Don't just post something. You can change the color of the tag and then sort of hide their handle in the background so that it's not a ton of tags in there, but let people know what you're posting. Then it'll increase your chances of them reposting or at least just engaging with it. And then in the copy of the post, you can also tag people. So look for ways to just let other people know what you're doing, whether it's about them or not. It's a great way to engage with each other on social media. And so you may see us tagging all of you, and we hope that you'll repost those also and definitely tag us back. Then another way to increase engagement is to email this update out to your supporters. And so you can talk about why your organization has signed on to the CERD report, why menthol is a priority for all of you, and then ask people to repost on social media and link to what you're posting on social media, saying, please engage with us on social media. It's a great way to amplify the message. That's it for me, but look out for our thank you email with that sample social media content, sample photos and videos of menthol cigarettes so that you can create your own images. And I look forward to answering any of your questions about our communications efforts.
Thank you, Megan, and really thanks for reminding us that we need to do everything to disseminate this as much as possible. And for example, some of the things we'll do, we've already in touch also with some of the committee members from these, those 18 committee members who are the members of the CERD committee, the convention to address the Convention Against All Discrimination, Racial Discrimination. So we've already been in contact with them, and for sure we'll be contacting them ahead of this process and through this process. But also, for example, there's a UN working group that works on addresses issues associated with for the African diaspora. So they will be receiving that information also, that UN working group, or the working group that works on business and human rights, for example, within the UN. So we'll make sure that the entire world is aware of this report, and that the lack of action from the US is a form of discrimination against a big part of the African American community in the United States. So now we have ample time for Q&A. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this was meant to be a little bit of a training, so to help you have a better understanding on how to use the whole process associated with the report that will be submitted to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And to clarify what that is, again, I think it was mentioned, but someone asked a question earlier about what CERD is. So CERD is the acronym for the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and that's the body of independent experts that monitors the implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is this human rights treaty on racial issues that the US has ratified, hence it is law in the United States. Again, feel free to type any additional questions you may have using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. The first question that there's a question that came a few times, and I've noticed that it's been answered already via text. However, it's about making the very first deadline that we have is on July for the comments to the FDA. If Kelsey or if Carol, one of you wants to just make it very clear what's the best way to make comments and to get help on how to write those comments.
So I submitted Ash's comment yesterday, so I'm happy to talk about it a little bit. There's a link that you can go to on the FTA website that brings you right to the comment. You can make it an attachment, or you can write it in the body of an email, and it can be as long or as short as you want. I think there might be a length limit, but it's long, like 10, 20 pages. So there's lots of space to do that. I put the link to the Public Health Law Center's research, their talking points on the topic in the link. And I'm happy to share the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids template as well, which was very helpful. I don't see it anywhere online with a quick look, so let me do a quick search, and if not, I will ask them if it's okay to share it with this group. I did see a question to ask if you need help to come to ASH. I think it depends what you need help on. I'm happy to give very quick guidance on how to use the FDA website or anything like that. But if you have content questions, I think the best group to go to is probably Public Health Law Center. They do a lot of work around the FDA, and they've already expressed their willingness to help. So feel free to contact me if I can help, or I can help you be put in touch with the right people.
And ditto for AATCLC. On our website, we will next week have all of the information, templates that people can use and links to take you directly to the FDA comment. Public Health Law Center, I think, are they the go-to people. But we just want to help encourage people to know that it is important. Your voice does count. And then just to think about who else you could reach out to encourage them to do the same thing, because the industry is going to inundate the process. And we need just regular people and organizations and entities to weigh in on this.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for that reminder, because the industry will flood the process. So we need to make sure that we're there to really counter that. Charles, do you have anything to add to this specific concept? No.
No, not really. Just that, if you're a member of the DC Tobacco Free Coalition, we've sent out several mailings on how to submit comments, and I will probably do a couple of more.
Okay. Then I have a question for you, though, Charles. Now, what would be your recommendation so you very quickly, you were an early adopter. You were like, this is an opportunity, let's use it and maximize on this opportunity to engage in the treaty process. And it worked in DC. What would be your recommendation to the audience here and those who are maybe reticent, okay, maybe I should, just wait or not do it? I know in the context of smoke-free, I remember in 2003, when we were negotiating the international treaty, we had to go alone, really as only a handful of organizations calling in for smoke-free policies, because civil society, the NGOs, thought it was too radical. This is too radical. Let's not ask for a smoke-free environment. Aren't you afraid that it could be by those who are like, oh, I'm not going to sign on to this report, that actually are missing an opportunity to not be on the right side of history? What would be your recommendations, and what would you suggest to other groups who are not yet joining that report to CERD on tobacco and menthol?
I'm sorry, Laurent, was that for me?
Yes, that was for you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I just want to kind of reiterate what everyone said before, that this is a human rights issue. And if you care about human rights issues, then this is something that you want to read, you definitely want to sign on to. And this document is very powerful. It can be shared with policymakers, legislation, people passing legislation, especially with different types of laws being passed now, especially flavored tobacco bans. This information can be shared in different communities on different topics.
Indeed, and we're given an opportunity. There's not many international processes like that offer the ability to participate in a formal way. This is an opportunity to basically help rewrite public health history. And so many of those, the battles that AATCLC, for example, has had to fight to rewrite public health history and address the menthol issue have been so difficult. And now we have this tool offered to us and this opportunity to submit a report within a very specific deadline. Why not use it? Because it's a really strong, powerful weapon to our arsenal to address this public health issue. Carol, would you have any comments on that?
Just, I agree with you that it's a powerful tool, and that this is the moment. So this is, for us, this is our year of no menthol, and it's a year, we're halfway through it, and it's been a wonderful year with all of our flowers are blooming for the seeds that we worked so hard to plant and till the soil. So this is just a very strong tool that we have that we can all use and move the mission, move our goals along.
Indeed, I think it's a powerful amplifier for our message. And so there's a question here comes from Amos Hausner about it's about using other treaties. So obviously there's whether in the United States, the American for Disabilities at the national level, but also there is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Kelsey, as you well know, we work on a number of treaties. Maybe it might be helpful to clearly, this is not the only treaty we can use, but I think maybe an important message is how using treaties in other countries and human rights treaties is helping us really get new partners on board and really raising awareness about the issue of tobacco and outside of the health ministries. Can you maybe expand on that?
Sure. So there's a lot of parts to that, I think. First, to answer the question directly, the American with Disabilities Act is a really interesting concept of, we know that people with disabilities smoke a lot at higher rates than other populations as well. We haven't really looked into it, but I think it's great. In addition to that, there's a convention on the rights of people with disabilities, and we have looked into that a little bit and would love to do that for a country coming up in the right cycle. So I think that's something we could absolutely pursue. We also work under, and I mentioned them very briefly, but there's a lot of them, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. In a lot of places, women are smoking, increasing smoking rates where men are decreasing smoking rates. It's often tied to women's liberation, and it can be really, really targeted advertising to women. So we're working on that as well. We're particularly working on one in France right now around that convention. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is another one that's really important, and we do work with around the world. We did one in Germany. And then there's sort of a broad catch-all under the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So we can always use that one in countries where the other ones don't work. So there's a lot of opportunities to get into the human rights system. And our overarching goal is to start convincing the human rights system that tobacco is a problem that applies to them, but also convincing the tobacco control community that tobacco is a human rights problem. So we work on it from both sides, and we hope that we're starting to make progress. I think we are. So all of these are great ways to do that.
And at the local level, from a comms perspective, that there's obviously lots of opportunities. So we know, like you mentioned, the Convention Against All Discrimination Against Women, and we know there's California cities and Pittsburgh and a few other cities that are basically, and that's a treaty that the US has not ratified. So not as much power as CERD, Convention Against All Racial Discrimination, which has been ratified by the US, but however was used for local comms. What would be then the recommendations, and what would be the first easy wins, the low-hanging fruits for comms? Megan, maybe you can go first, and Carol, and then after Charles, because I think there's tons of really, really low-hanging fruit opportunities that the audience could benefit from to strengthen and their communication campaigns through the summer, using that report, their engagement in that report, and to do their local communication also. So what are low-hanging fruits? And that, as you can see, at a level from very local to national, and maybe even international.
Yeah, from the local level, I would be sharing as many personal stories as possible of families hurt by menthol. I think it's really compelling, and it builds support for us easily. Those are stories that you can share with reporters. You can write as an lead-in for your op-ed, your letter to the editor. You can share them on social media, whether the person wants to go on a photo or video or not. If it's you sharing their story with their permission, their consent, absolutely. But I think that oftentimes we get bogged down in the stats and forget the human element of it. So I think as much as we're able to bring back those human stories to the forefront, that's what's going to really get people on our side.
Yes, and I agree with the human story. So when in my presentations, I talk about the 45,000 African Americans who die every year, but then I talk about one, and sometimes one that's related to me because I have some personal stories with my own family. And I want to just say that, so on our website, we will be having the resolutions for cities to adopt. That's non-binding. And it's really a low-hanging fruit because it doesn't require the city to do anything other than to affirm that this is a human rights issue for African Americans, and that we need to start working on the end game for tobacco products in our country. And in San Francisco, when the FDA first was given the authority, when the Tobacco Control Act was signed, the city and county of San Francisco signed a resolution to that effect, that that they wanted the FDA to do something. And then so those resolutions said they put it on the mind of the elected officials without requiring them to spend any money or do anything. And then you can go back and say, this is what you have affirmed some years ago, and now the next step is to do this. And when San Francisco banned menthol and flavored cigarettes, it was the same county supervisor on her way out who had introduced that first resolution that was non-binding, and that went to the law in San Francisco that got rid of Newport and mentholated tobacco product sales in the city and county of San Francisco. So to think that you're building a movement and you might not be the person who carries it, you're passing the baton. So you want to get in the race, you want to have the baton and be ready to pass it on to the next level of the work, and to know we've been in this for so long so we can see things that we might have thought was what didn't work, that it was working and it was percolating there. So this is important, an important time for us, an important year. And that when George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, to see the world protest for the racism and the inhumanities that African Americans suffer in the United States, it made us all feel good, and to know that we're all a part of this. And so as the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, we anoint you to take this on, to include this in your work. And we are here as a resource for you as well, but to advance, to move this, because this is the year of great movement in tobacco control. And we have the momentum going, and we just need to keep working.
Thank you for this, Carol. So now to getting very, very specific then. So for example, at the DC level, in DC, how is it going to help you now with the next phase? So having the report, and if, for example, if in DC, so Charles, if there is even international media, for example, if there's like, if the European media, let's say hypothetically, picks up on the US, a report criticizes US not taking fast, adequate action on menthol, calls on the US to ban menthol as quickly as possible, et cetera, et cetera. Will that help you in DC from a comms perspective and an advocacy perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with what Megan and what Carol said about the, getting involved. I believe in education and awareness. And, one of the things that we could do, or any of the people participating on this webinar could do, is partner with ASH or AATCLC or the DC Tobacco Free Coalition, or all three of us, to host a webinar, talking about CERD in your community and just getting the word out and the information out there. I think would be that's definitely a low-hanging fruit.
Great. And Kelsey, in terms of next steps in litigation, so we've engaged in that litigation. We've made a decision on what to do at the next steps with the litigation. But what about further litigation? So for people who are working at the local level in different jurisdictions in the United States, how would a CERD committee statement, strong statement on tobacco and menthol, how would that help local action, whether it's litigation or policy changes?
So US courts don't often look to international law. It's a shame, but they don't. So I don't know how much litigation will use this, but advocates certainly can. And advocates can include attorneys in litigation. So I think it's very powerful to be able to say a human rights body thinks that menthol advertising is a human rights violation. So I think from a legal perspective, the lawyer in me says it's not a lot of legal precedent, but the advocate in me says it's incredibly important. And also, Laurent, I wanted to point out that we are over time. So
for some reason, I thought I had this for an hour and a half. I thought it was an hour and a half training session. So really my apologies, because I had this, I would have concluded earlier. Really apologize to all of the attendees. For some reason, I had this as a one and a half hour training webinar. So I was gonna have everyone working harder today. So I really apologize from the bottom of my heart to all of you. So I'll just, please, I will have the speakers just give brief last statement, finishing thoughts, parting thoughts before we say we dismiss the webinar. Charles, why don't you start, followed by Megan, Kelsey, and we'll give Carol the last word.
Yeah, thank you, Laurent. Again, I want to thank you guys for inviting me to come out and present and just talk about the role that the DC Tobacco Free Coalition played in the first draft. And Carol had mentioned being anointed, and I've actually been anointed by the African American Tobacco Leadership Council, AATCLC. I'm their DC representative. So if you need to get in touch with a local advocate, that would be me. And the information can be shared through ASH. But I definitely want to reiterate the fact that this is a human health issue, and that we need to re-emphasize that, and that this document that we're going to be submitting in August and being reviewed in August is very important, and it's a powerful tool to use.
Thanks. Thanks for that message, Charles. And everyone, sign on to this document. It's a powerful tool to influence global health policy and US policy, health policy. Megan.
I'm just looking forward to seeing how many people we can have sign on to this report and how we can all work together to promote it on social media. Looking forward to tagging you all and really getting the message out there as a joint effort.
Thank you, Megan. And I think I'm sure we can get to hopefully over 500 signatories.
Yeah.
Kelsey?
Not to sound like a broken record, but a couple things. Sign on to the report, submit your FDA comments, and please use the right language. Human rights violation is very, very important. Social justice is very important. Health inequity. So I think using the language around this is hugely important. And lastly, let us know what we can do to help. That's it for me. Thanks.
Carol, as the founder of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership
Yes, so
Council,
we are a resource for all of you. We're working really hard, so please contact if you need us. We will be hosting the third Menthol National Conference in Washington, D.C. in September of this year. I put the link in the chat, so please come and join us in Washington, D.C. And I just want to once again thank Ash for your leadership on this issue and how much we appreciate you as the AATCLC and the work that we're doing and will continue to do together.
well, thank you. I want to thank all of the speakers and the attendees, and thank you all for working this very important new phase of tobacco control, which is really about making this connection, how tobacco impacts many, many rights and the rights of many different citizens in many ways, and we need to end that totally preventable epidemic. So thank you everyone. Stay tuned for other webinars through either listservs or in order to stay informed. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.